So welcome everybody. It's nice to see people in the flesh. I think this is our 14th annual Khyentse lecture, and thanks for coming. It will be recorded, but I'm glad that you came to see it in person. I'd like to begin by thanking the Khyentse Foundation, whose generous endowment allows us to hold this event each year. It's been a wonderful 14 years. Before introducing our speaker tonight, we have our annual ritual of giving the Khyentse Foundation Award for Excellence in Buddhist Studies to our most deserving undergraduate student in the field. And this year it's Kate Nash. If you could come up and be embarrassed. Thanks. So Kate is a senior graduating this spring in economics with, more importantly, a minor in Buddhist studies. She was actually born right here on the other side of the Richmond Bridge in Marin, or grew up there anyway, and I think her mother is here to celebrate with her. Upon coming to Cal in the fall of 2018, she chose to major in economics, partly inspired by her father, who helped foster her interest in business and the economy. And she had no plans whatsoever to pursue any other areas of study until March 2020, when her older brother, Will, passed away. She found herself seeking an academic container in which she could explore her relationship to him and to death, something with which she had little experience. She enrolled in a course on death, dreams, and visions in Tibetan Buddhism, and quickly confirmed her interest in this subject and its relevance to her experience. Since that time, she's taken many courses with all of us in Buddhist studies. I think I counted at least 6, maybe more depending on how you count. And she reports that these courses gave her a deep appreciation for the Buddhist path to liberation and how it can uplift individuals and communities. She took a year of Chinese and explored practices of mental fortitude, such as meditation. And these explorations, she told me, have changed her life and even helped her to begin to accept the really unacceptable passing of her brother to another realm. Next fall, after graduating, she plans to attend law school, where she'll focus on criminal law and eventually become an advocate for criminal justice reform. Buddhist studies, she informed me, with its key teachings on subjectivity and compassion, has consolidated her career goals, inspiring her to implement restorative justice alternatives to the purely punitive and potentially harmful approaches that are so common today. She expressed her gratitude for the opportunities the group in Buddhist Studies and its faculty have afforded her over the past couple of years, and looks forward to continuing her personal Buddhist journey in years to come. Thank you, Kate, for being such a wonderful student. This is Sydney J. from the Khyentse Foundation to present this certificate. Thank you. Maybe before, one more thing, I just want to mention a couple of events later in the semester that we have coming up. We have about a month of silence after this, and then on March 30th, Anne Blackburn is speaking on Buddhist inflected sovereignties across the Indian Ocean. And then right after that, a big conference on Buddhism and physics, sort of Buddhist philosophy and physics that we've been trying to hold each year. I think this is our 3rd attempt, so hopefully it'll work this time. And we have our visiting professor of Sanskrit, Federico Scorini, who's giving us a talk in the middle of April, I think. But tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Daniel Berounsky. In preparing my introduction, it occurred to me that tonight's talk could be seen as kind of like the third in a series of lectures on Bön ritual that have somehow made their way into this lecture series on Buddhist studies. Here I'm thinking of Tony Huber's talk in 2019, followed by Charles Ramble's in 2020. All of these lectures combine studies of rare manuscripts with ethnographic observation of the rites described, and I have a feeling Berounsky's talk may follow a similar track tonight. Perhaps the coincidence is no coincidence at all, but a reflection of the remarkable Bön materials that have come to light in recent years, materials that reveal surprising continuities between present-day practice along Tibet's geographic border regions and the ancient rites of pre-Buddhist Tibet. But to return to our speaker, Daniel Berounsky comes to us from Charles University in Prague, where he is a professor in the Institute of Asian Studies. He actually began with an MA in Judaic Studies, studying Hebrew at Charles University, but then in the course of those early studies, shortly after the wall came down, he traveled to Buryatia, to the north of Mongolia, and spent a year living at a small Tibetan Buddhist monastery, learning to play the drum and memorizing the ritual texts, which he said he pronounced with a strange Mongolian accent, but had no idea what they said. After that year, it was a little later, he went and spent a further year down in India with the Tibetan exile communities, and there he deepened his training in Tibetan language, and gradually his interest shifted to Tibetan studies. And finally, in 2005, he completed his Ph.D. thesis on the wrathful deity Yamantaka and its associated myths and rituals. Since that time, Berounsky has worked on a series of fascinating projects. Indeed, I would say it is in part his eye for new and interesting areas of research that sets his work apart. I think he received your habilitation for the study of a Tibetan version of the scripture of the Ten Kings, is that right? Yeah. Published in 2012, a study based on a rare manuscript copy of a Tibetan translation of the apocryphal Chinese classic. Piece by piece in this book, his study builds a story that begins in India with the Vedas and early Buddhist writings on hell, and then takes the reader through China and finally into Tibet. The book is really enjoyable to read and a testament to Berounsky's ability to weave a good story out of his rigorous research. He came to my seminar on Tuesday and regaled us with lots of good stories. Some of the same strengths are seen in his more recent articles on the Nyen, about which we will hear more this evening. Again, in these pieces, Berounsky is working with some recently discovered manuscripts, this time from eastern Tibet and the region of Amdo, where he regularly visits. These materials are really very difficult to read, but he does so admirably. And again, his analysis is well written and nicely organized. And finally, I should also mention Berounsky's most selfless act, other than raising twins, which he's in the middle of doing. He's about to host the triennial meeting of the International Association of Tibetan Studies this July. This is a huge amount of work and a great service to the field. And many of us are really looking forward to visiting his university and sampling the much touted beers of Prague. So with these words of introduction, Daniel will be speaking. Well, you have your title there. Join me in welcoming him to the podium.
So thank you very much, Jake, for introducing me. I feel embarrassed hearing your too kind words. I would like to say that I feel really honored to be here in this wonderful, a bit exotic place for me. And I would like to thank Jake and Sanjay for all the organizing work, and I would like to thank also Khyentse Foundation for their generosity. Today I I'm going to speak about my relatively recent research projects, and it will concern the Nyen, as the title says, which is a relatively unknown collection of apparently ancient myths. And second topic, which is somehow connected with it, is recently discovered tradition of lay ritualists called Leu, and I have an hypothesis that both things are somehow interconnected. But I will start with approaching the topic more general, in more general way at the beginning, and I will try to introduce some of the historical background of that tradition, which is very important, I believe, in Tibet, tradition of ritual myths on origin, or antecedent myths, or antecedent tales, as it is also called. So as an introduction, we have a situation that we know that the Tibetan Empire appeared out of sudden in the 7th century. We have almost no information what was existing there before that time, but we can suppose that there were various human societies, and the rise of the Tibetan Empire somehow resembles, as Eliot Sperling used to say, the rise of later empires of Arabs and Mongols. It was in a very quick time, suddenly there appeared a big and strong empire. We can, when looking at the customs related to burials, it can be observable that this time of creation of the Tibetan Empire is followed by a change of burial customs. Suddenly, out of sudden, there appears a tradition of raising huge tombs, which until recently we knew about only some of them, but recently with the project by Guntram Hazot, we know that there are hundreds of them, in fact, in central Tibet. And we can take it as a sign of some change in religion of that empire. It could well mark the change of religion, and we can suppose that a sort of pan-Tibetan imperial religion started to be formed. And hypothetically, there were diverse communities until that time about which we have almost no. And we can suppose some process of formation of that pan-Tibetan religion. And it is often, when we speak about that imperial time, out of necessity, we speak sometimes about non-Buddhist religion or Tibetan imperial religion, but in fact, we can suppose that there was a great variety of something like that. And to introduce or to say something about that myths on origin or antecedent myths, antecedent tales, it is clear that it's very, very important element of that non-Buddhist religions of any kind on the Tibetan plateau. It somehow continues to be important until the present day, and we know nowadays that it is the myth on the origin or the tale, antecedent tale, which infuses the ritual with its meaning. Without that myth, the ritual would become meaningless. And it was happening later on quite frequently that Buddhists on the Tibetan plateau somehow erased that myth. And it led to the situation that what remained is without any meaning, the consequences of some ritual tune, which make no sense. Those myths which are so important are called in Tibetan mostly mang, which is connected with verb ma, to speak. So it's something which is spoken. But alternatively, there appears a term rap, which I hypothetically consider with some attempt to organize these myths in the series of them. And typically this term rap appears when some account from the large series of the myths appears. In some cases, those myths are also called pe, which means model, example, which shows their function. But we have great diversity of those myths. Unfortunately, nobody tried to establish some basic typology of them because they can be very diverse. We have, on the one hand, we have very long, very fine poetic myths available. On the other hand, there are very brief, abbreviated myths which resemble a sort of catalog, that it's a list of names and localities. While some of these myths start with creation of the world, there are another myths which speak about sometimes a real place in the timeless past, and so on. As I said, their function was clearly to reenact some past mythical event in the present time, and this can be recognized even from such myths which are available nowadays, which are from post-imperial period, but also from some myths available among the Dunhuang documents. And they usually say, as it was beneficial and fortunate in the past, it is also beneficial and fortunate in the present. And this frequently appears as a concluding sentence of these myths. And as has been already said, they are sometimes called pe models, examples, and it shows clearly that those were to be followed. And we have some example from one version of the Nyen book, Nyen Bum, I will speak about later, which says applying such pe models from the good wisdom or law, or how to translate the term, Zuglak of the past. The true was exposed by voicing the bon. And in this example, we have a connection of that habit of voicing the myth on origin. It is connected with the term Zuglak, which in old Tibetan documents frequently characterizes some sort of law connected with Tibetan emperors. And there is probably skip this because this term Zuglak was discussed a long time ago. It was proposed that this could be a term this could be a term for old Tibetan religion, but then it was disputed by Rolf Stan, and it has been translated in a number of ways as a governance, wisdom, as a last proposal by Johanna Bialek was principles, that it would be the most fitting way to translate it. Anyway, I would like to show some examples which are post-imperial, which are not from the imperial time, but mainly from Bönpo sources, which connect this term Tsulak with the practice of voicing the myth on origin, as could be, for example, this one from Bönpo work, Donandreva Tika, which can be dated before 14th century, that it will be, it says, it will be in some myth. It will be exposed in great core treatises of Tsulak, the specific manners of their voicing, Gyertap, will be passed on each tradition of narration on origin. Thus all the created world would be understood, which clearly shows that it considers this tradition of voicing the myths on origin. It connects it with the most important understanding of the world. That is the basic manner, way of understanding the surrounding world. And it also connects the specific ways of voicing, which points to the orality as a principal means connected with that tradition. And this is connected with that Tsulak as an old Tibetan art, law, or whatever we would translate it. And in another example, which is again from Nyen, this is part which follows after a solemn oath which was performed, and suddenly it says, it speaks again, there was a conflict between gods and Nyen beings, and there was a stone was planted there, and then in poetic verses it says, on the earth of not hearing, the conch shell was blown, on the earth of not understanding, the ritual narration of Tsulak was pronounced. And what continues is a description of an animal sacrifice, through which this would be hardly connected with the monastic Bon tradition, monastic tradition. So these were examples of connecting this tradition of voicing the myth or the tale on origin with that term Tsulak. Unfortunately, we don't have, to my memory, any clear explanation, any clear description of performance of that myth in the oldest documents from Dunhuang. But scattered appeared some fragments in the Bönpo literature, and I would like to offer one of these fragments from 14th century monumental Bönpo work, Zijit, organized in 12 volumes, which was revealed as a treasure revelation in 14th century, but of course we don't know whether some parts of it are all older. And when discussing the part of the Bönpo teaching which is called Chabnak, black waters, which is somehow understood to be the lower part of the teachings of Bon, and where some probably old features survive. The text speaks about the ritual purification, ritual cell, and describes clearly that when voicing the myth on origin, animal voices and voices of birds were imitated during that performance. And it again, it's in the concluding sentence, it says that for this section, Blackwaters, origin narration is the most important thing, that which again, I'm repeating myself, stresses the importance of that ritual narrations for the ritual itself. This is quite puzzling for me personally, because if imitating voices of animals like horses, dogs, tiger, and so on, it means at the same time it somehow implies that voicing the myth was not understandable to the humans, and it was probably primarily focused on spirits and on divinities. At the same time, we can suppose it's even nowadays in the Bon tradition that they are using the ways of imitating such voices of animals in the tantric tradition, and the same appears in the Buddhist traditions, where this term gyer, which appears in connection with this specific voicing, is retained with that very well-known way of chanting, namely tantric text, which resembles that overtone singing and so on. So it is probably somehow surviving. But the question is how it could happen that even among the Dunhuang documents, among the oldest documents, we have surviving copies of manuscripts which are recording these texts. It is apparent that these texts were very firmly bound with oral tradition, and the question is who wrote them down and what was the reason. We will probably never have some clear answer of that, but it can be somehow supposed that it's more likely that it was written down by people who attempted to organize the Tibetan religion into the pan-Tibetan tradition. It's more likely than some local insignificant tradition that this would be written down. We know that when Buddhism appeared almost simultaneously with that various ritual traditions on the Tibetan plateau, that for some time they coexisted next to each other in a way which seems to not to be very problematic. We have quite many texts from Dunhuang which contain the critique of the Bönpo funeral rituals, and this seems to be a crucial point for the Buddhists. They didn't agree with the Bönpo, or Bönpo, I would not call it Bönpo, with the indigenous ritual traditions and their funeral rituals. And although it is repeated there frequently that animal sacrifice was seen as problematic, we have one fragment recently appearing in Sampan Skaik's article, which speaks about that ritual narratives. And the argument from the side of Buddhists is that the ritual narratives of the Bönpo of Tibet are not in agreement, that they are chaotic, that they are diverse, and so on. Semfansky argues in his article, or he says something that probably the Buddhists didn't understand the non-Buddhist ritual traditions, but I don't think that is necessarily the case. And just to illustrate it, I would like to use an example from apparently old texts which were discovered at the beginning of this millennium in South Tibet, in Gatang Bumpa stupa. It is area which is close to Arunachal Pradesh and eastern part of Bhutan, and it's not surprising that Tony Huber worked with that text as well. Among those texts were discovered in old stupa, and it was nice, very precious. That, as you can see, the sample here, the writing resembles that of Dunhuang documents. It is very difficult to date it. We don't know basically, but Samten Karmei says that it could be 11th century or earlier, but in fact we don't know. What is important for us that there is almost no Buddhist terminology in it, and most of the manuscripts are connected with non-Buddhist ritual, and of course they contain a series of that origin narrations or antecedent tales. And among them appears also a series of 14 such narrations which are dealing with very sinister topic, and it's untimely death of pregnant women. And I would like to use it as an argument because with Dunhuang documents there are unfortunate circumstances that although we have some very nice samples of these myths which are part of some collection, almost no collection is complete, that we don't know what was the structure. In this case, we have 14 tales on similar topic, and it forms the certain unit, and perhaps we can learn something. The third narration, I will not read it, but it speaks about death of pregnant lady. It typically gives the name of the father and of the mother of the lady, and in this case the lady is called Goza Chamdharma, and it says then that in the valley she lived in, all the spirits and divinities fell in love with her because she was very beautiful. Her face was like a full moon, and her body was elastic as a sprout of bamboo, as the text says. And it appears that she was in love with one of the demonic beings of the valley, but her father decided to marry her to another man from another valley. Text says that after 9 months, which means that she was pregnant, she traveled to visit her father, and on the way she met herder of goats and herder of sheep, and it happened that during an incident she died basically 9 times. That they threw the stone which caused her death. Then the horse she was riding on fell into the gorge. There were rolling stones which killed her again, and so on. And being killed, including her baby, 9 times, as a consequence there appeared 9 demons in her body. Then we have a very brief description of the ritual, starting that the ritualist was, which in this case is Dibon Raja Kiel, and it says he erected 9 cairns of demons Di. He prepared 9 birds' heads, it's something, I don't know, some ritual item, and 9 holes, 9 skins, some vessel, and 9 kinds of blood. And we can see that then he used some pipes, and apparently he was trying to lead away the demons from the body of the deceased lady. And then it says that the demons were pacified, and it mentions even tomb, that she was placed to the side of the tomb. Just to give you an example, fortunately many of these tales, of these 14 tales, they contain of real localities, and they also the names of mythical priests which we can connect together. And from this list and the map, we can see that they are dealing with area which is in central and southern Tibet. When we focus on that brief description of that rituals, we realize suddenly that those rituals which are performed on behalf of the deceased pregnant woman are very variable, that they are not uniform at all, that in some cases they appear, they're using vulture and so on, that there is a great variety of that ritual. And finally, we can see that the tales, which can be numbered 8 to 13, are very similar in their structure, and they contain the same phrases in the middle of the narration. And even at the conclusion of the 13th tale, it is said that the chapter has concluded, which it is clear then that originally this formed some separate collection of the myth. Then the tales, the 1st to 6th tale, they are connected with mythical priest Raja Kigyel, and we can suppose that originally it was a self-contained part which was connected with this mythical priest. So, concluding, we can perhaps see that these series of that myth were somehow compounded together, and it's just a question of hypothesis, or just a question open, whether this was the way by which that pan-Tibetan religion was somehow construed. That they just combined various traditions, put them together, and we can also see that narrations are of similar length. So we can suppose that also they were somehow transformed, formally edited, just to fit that whole connection. And what I want to stress that from articles from Dunhuang, where we have some collection, sort of catalog, which is related to these tales, to these origin myths, it is clear that there are other examples coming from central Tibet. And when it comes to the eastern Tibet, then either some mythical land, Tangye, is mentioned as standing for all the vast areas of eastern Tibet, or simply Do is mentioned. And it seems that these parts, as if they would be somehow neglected, that the core of these collections would be Central Tibet and Southern Tibet. At the same time, we have definitely some examples of myths from Dunhuang which are probably of Eastern Tibetan origin. I should skip this because I'm talking too long, and now I would like to come to the topic of Nyembum, which clearly represents a collection of myths which are connected with Eastern Tibet, and there is an underlying question again: who stands and what circumstances stand behind compiling this collection of these myths, to which I don't have a definite answer. This Nyen collection, the most extensive version, is contained it is a volume which is a part of Bönpo Kangyur scripture, and it is divided into 26 chapters called Leu, and altogether it's on 165 folios. But then we have another version which was found in Eastern Tibet among the so-called Leu texts, which I will come to later on, which is not identical, which is of different wording, but contains some myths which are similar to those which appear in the version A, the Bönpo Kangyur version. And then we have a version which appears in the Terma treasure text rediscovered by a prolific Bönpo treasure revealer, Ponce Kyungotel, living in 12th to 13th century. This last version is a part of a larger collection of texts which is heavily influenced by Tantric religion, but just one chapter appears there where there is no tantric influence, no mantra, and it contains one longer myth, which I will speak about soon. About the content of the Nyen collection. It has, in the first part, it contains myths which are dealing with some blending, mixing up of various spirits. And this was probably seen apparently as something very dangerous, which should be somehow remedied via ritual. This is also connected with some myths where some improper sexual behavior is described, connected with incest, and apparently this is somehow related. Then we have a part containing several myths which speak about the origin of that Nyen and the various kings of Nyen and various Nyen beings are described there. The Nyen means fierce one, is something fierce, and the lords of the Nyen are described, for example, as a huge stag with golden antlers who is drinking fog, and he stretches between the earth and they are of composite character, composite nature. They consist of animal parts typically. It's another lord of Nyen is a frog, a huge frog with horns and so on. The next part of the Nyen collection contains almost legal myths which are describing some original conflict between the original people and the Nyen. And typically then or somebody is killed, and then it's necessary to pay the compensation for killing the Nyen, which is very frequent in general, I think, in Tibet, which is called Dong, the price for killing someone. But it's practiced even in the present time in Amdo quite frequently. And then next section of that Nyenbun contains short myths describing how the Nyen, being angry, they spread diseases, because in the medical works, the Nyen are connected also with some diseases, and these are mostly diseases which manifest through various poxes. And the typical, or the priest who figures in this collection is Nyenbon Tangtang Dolwa. But there appears very frequently Shenrab Miwo, who is not a Buddha-like figure like in other monastic Bon texts. He is just one of the mythical priests, and he's sometimes described as performing a ritual including animal sacrifice. And it is a question how it was possible to include it into Bönpo Kanjur. But what is significant and important, that there are of certain Nam language, that there appear parts which are written in a way that there is some name, and it says in Nampadong language it is so and so, in Pugye language it's so and so. This feature appears also in Dunhuang documents. You have 731 ITJ and 73, and it was a long time ago that on the basis of these mentions, British scholar Thomas came up with a dictation, which I agree is wrong. He supposed some Dunhuang manuscripts which are written in Tibetan script, but we believe example Nam language. Anyway, there was a review of his book in 1950 by his professor Wen Yu, who tried to localize that Nam using the type of a small kingdom which appeared in 8th century in the Minshan mountain, in this region, in these mountains, where, as we will see later, it is exactly the same place where this Leu tradition appears nowadays. In texts, we have a mention of certain Nam Dong Chom locality, old Tibetan annals, that there was a council was held there. It's apparently somewhere in Amdo, but we don't know exactly where. And I have only hypothesis, which is not proved, that it could be similar as what is today Dongchom, that it's which is called Tachang in Chinese, where we have some fortresses which were Tibetan. It was occupied by Tibetans for a long time, and appears not far from that, or almost at that Minshan mountain range. So the main character through the Nyenbun is frequently son of Dong, called Dongbu or Dongse, which shows clearly that it's connected with the Dong, mythical Dong clan of Tibetans, which is somehow not exactly the same, but related to something which what Chinese chronicles describe as Qiang people. Qiang people, that they are, it doesn't match exactly, but it could be something similar. And it is clear that we have some tradition of Dong people here. And the question is why this was written down. It appears that these bilingual mentions are not as what Thomas supposed translation of some names, but that they attempted to facilitate some understanding of people from central Tibet or from the pan-Tibetan tradition, as if, and it could be hypothesis that it was created again to become the part of that pan-Tibetan religious tradition, which is compounded from various elements, but we do not know. And there is one myth, which is far the longest from the Nyen Collection of various versions, but I was able to find 13 versions of this myth. And surprisingly, it appears among the Nashi ritual texts. Nashi people live there of Tibeto-Burmese stock. They live in Sichuan and Yunnan provinces, and they are well known for the nice pictographic script, which is here we have the version, the Nashi version of that myth, which proves some connection between these Eastern Tibetan tradition connected with Ldong and Nashi rituals. I don't want to bother you with all these versions. You can see that there are quite many of them. Those which we can localize, where they found, show that it was at the periphery of the Tibetan plateau, but it was in Western Tibet, Eastern Tibet, Southern Tibet. And this myth is the only one, you can see the names of the main characters, that they are not exactly the same, but quite similar in the respective versions. And the myth is, the basis of the myth is rather simple. It seems to be a founding myth for Ldong people, their origin. And it says that at the beginning there was a land of Nyen, and it gives the name of the father of Nyen, the son of the Nyen. And then there was land of Ldong people. Again, it names the father and the daughter and the son of the Ldong people. And it happened that the son of the Nyen descended from the sky to the earth, and the daughter of Ldong people became very attracted by him. And they were making love in the fields, and some version described that the order of the world was reversed, that, for example, tigers were taking care of the cattle, and so on and so on. But the brother, her brother, the son of Ldong, learned about it. And according to some versions, the mythical character of Wise Bat told him it. According to other versions, it was the servant of him, and so on. And he came to the place. The son of the Nyen transformed into the snake, and the angry son of Ldong, the brother of the girl, cut him into 1,000 pieces. And only later on she revealed him that it was in fact a Nyen, that he was not an ordinary Nyen or something like that. So they tried to hide his corpse below the earth surface, and they polluted the place not to be found. And meanwhile, the father of the Nyen, not having son returning home, he guarded armies of Nyen and went with his armies to search for him. And then there could be longer stories or shorter stories. It's meanwhile being chased by the Nyen. They escape basically to Machen Pomra, who is described as a lord of Yulsa divinities, Yulha divinities. And there are somehow Machen Pomra, which is called Kula Machen Pomra, is somehow related to the Ldong people. And then it describes the contest in archery between the Lord of Nyengendarwa and the Lord of Yusa Machen Pomra. And Machen Pomra wins. Anyway, they chase the son of Dong further, and there appear these three mountain divinities which could be localized. The first, Nyengen Darwa, it was just by an accident that I learned that it's a mountain in the thing where the Teleu ritual, and it's a sort of rock. It's the picture up there. And he figures quite frequently in other texts, in Jutic texts, I saw it, or if you remember the wonderful myth on origin of Tibetans, Unak Miu Drachak, which was worked with on by Samten Karmei, there appears as an ancestor certain old Nyen Deva. It's the same character, and it's the mountain divinity apparently of that Tewo region. So the itinerary of that main character could be mapped through this Nyenje Gomon, which is not far from Labrang Monastery, from Amchok. This is the village Amchok, on the way from Labrang to Khyentse. And this is the only myth which contains also bilingual mentions of some names in Minyake, which could be translated as Tangut, but we don't know if it predates the Tangut period or Tangut kingdom. And this is the only exception that it gives some names in Minyak, language of Minyak. And yeah, as a consequence, because I'm not specialist on the Nashi religion, but going through Joseph Rock's publication on Naga cult, it became apparent that actually it's not a Naga cult what Joseph Rock speaks about, but that there appear frequently these spirits, which are including also Nyen and Sadak and the spirits of rocks. And here we have some of the versions. We don't have time for this. And few words, this is the last topic, Leu tradition. It was, in the last decades, it was, I think, the first article published in Tibetan by Ngawang Gyatso, a Tibetan nowadays professor at Lanzhou University, who is native of Tewo region. You can see Tewo there from the Minshan mountain range. I think it was in 2005 that he published in the local Amdo journal an article in Tibetan identifying this Leu tradition, which was prevalent in the region before the Cultural Revolution. And now there are hundreds, if not thousands, manuscripts scattered in the households in the regions, which became collected. And so far almost 200, this is old slide, almost 200 volumes of their reproductions were published. But this tradition is called Leu, which is written as a chapter. And in the region they call also ritualist Leu. That is the Leu ritualist. And we have almost no information on their background. I traveled there with Ngawang Gyatso to some part of Tewo, the region called Bozo, and we visited two old ritualists who performed the rituals before the Cultural Revolution, the only ones who are surviving in the region. And It is clear that this ritual tradition was somehow with the worship of Nyen and Lu, who played significant role. One of the old ritualists told me that during performance, during voicing the myths, they used the voice of Nyen and the voice of Lu. Lu are in the region more connected with females. The rituals connected with Lu are the matter of females, while Nyen are connected with the males. And he told me to laugh because there are a number of Bönpo monasteries in the region, and he said that these Bönpo monks do not know who Nyen really are because they to make them protectors of the monasteries. But if they would know who Nyen are, they would know that it's impossible because they are just Nyen. They are fierce one, following just themselves, and they cannot be made protectors of the monastery. And the tradition was prevalent in this region, and what is quite striking that it's apparently not just a local tradition. We have old references in the Tibetan texts about certain Leu. And it seems that the only one typically who noticed that was Rolfstan, a French Tibetologist, already in 1959 when he published his book on Gesar epic, where he was interested in some tradition connected with orality, with bards, and so on. And suddenly he noticed that in the scripture Katangdena, there appears certain mention of old texts which are hidden as a terma. In the Tulnang Ramoche temple, which is one of the most holiest temples in Lhasa. And in the list of the text, there appears Leu, and Rolfstan recognized that it's not just a chapter, but it's certain text. It is ascribed to Padmasambhava, who wrote it down and passed it to the Tibetan emperor, the inventor of Tibetan script. It's apparently somehow mythical, but it's quite interesting that it's through the semi-history myth, it's connected with the beginnings of literacy in Tibet and with the past. Another interesting mention, which was noticed by Rolfstan, is a chronicle Feast of Scholars, which repeats the version of Bashe Chronicle, the extended version Shattagma, where it is described that at the time of Tisongdetsen, he started to speak, he looked into some book of his ancestors, and he spoke about the Chinese Leutze, and then it's called Leuketse. And he calls it Zulak, again this term, and that through this Zulak, he praised it because the statute of his ancestor became, they gained supernatural powers through that. And we don't know if this is exactly the same as Leu. Anyway, there are a number of Bönpo texts which are mentioning certain Leu. And I will not go through all of them, but for the most cases, they speak suddenly not about a Leu tradition, but they speak about Leu divinities, which are sometimes written down as Legu. And one of the early sources, which is repeated many times, Bönpo sources contains a list of crimes. And among those crimes is mentioned is the Cholwe Leu Halok. To oppose this mention between the family-like matters, which makes clear that these Leu divinities should be somehow seen similarly connected with the family relationship. Another mention appears in Do Dimensity, that Bönpo scripture in 12 volumes. There is a story, there is a myth and story connected with the Jutic divination, and it says that the queen became ill, and the illness was caused by the Lu spirit, that chthonic spirit. And the story goes on and continues, and suddenly it speaks about the Leu divinities who caused the illness, which makes clear that Lu, chthonic spirit, is the same as Leu, Leulha, Leu divinity. And then we have in that Nyen collection, we have also mentions of Leu. In one case, suddenly the ritualist is called not Leu, but owner of Leu divinities, Leul Habdak. And it says that there are Leu divinities, those of Sadak, Lu, and Nyen, from which it is clear that it's identified with these spirits, which is somehow enigmatic, but just searching for some references, I found references that this Leu, it appears in the dictionary by Chögy Drapa, but it was early by Ngawang Tendar, that Leu, some meaning of that term, it means it means Leuha are divinities of small children, but I don't think they were right, because even in some medical texts, this term Leu could designate fetus. And through this connection, I can come with some hypotheses based on some information gained from that region where the Leus are spread. Because I know that the local people believe that Nyen are those who bring children to people. And there is even a ritual performed which is called a Nyen Lab, that childless couples, they ritually ask Nyen to bring the people. And this is why in the region it's widespread to have names with Nyen. That it's the Nyen Truk, Nyen Drup, Nyen Kyap, and so on, because it's an expression of thanks to the Nyen that they brought children. And it's now, the hypothesis is that simply the Leuha are divinities who bring children to the people, and those are Nyen at the same time, but could be also Lu, who are believed in the region that they are bringing children. And now it would be probably more clear how to read the first mention from that this Chorwe Leu Halok, opposing this Chorwa could mean something to store something somewhere. So it would be opposing the divinity of fetus which was stored into the womb, would be probably meaning of this phrase. And this is all from my side. Thank you for your patience and for your attention.